Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This is Part 4, Chapter 3, entitled A Kaleidoscope in Slow Rotation. The crinkling of paper being crushed, then smoothed out repeatedly, was one of the few sounds that could be heard in the hallway, as Izuku stood once again in front of the principal's office. Aizawa had slipped the note to him discreetly that morning, and Izuku had spent the better part of the day trying to anticipate what the meeting would entail. It was the first Izuku had heard from the principal since giving him his notebooks, and he had no idea what to expect. When he entered, the room was much the same as it had been the last time. However, this time Nezu was sitting at his desk rather than the wall of monitors, and there was a chair set up opposite to Nezu, with tea in between them. And sitting innocently to the side were his notebooks, all together in a neat pile. "Midoriya, please take a seat." Izuku silently obeyed, placing his bag by his feet and clasping his hands together in his lap. "Thank you for giving me access to your journals. They've been quite the interesting read. I was wondering, though, if you had any more. Despite the amount of information within them, there seemed to be a few gaps, either between heroes or time elapsed between entries." Nezu looked so expectant, obviously knowing the answer was that yes, he did have more. But he had already exposed himself, sharing this much. He didn't want to share the others, especially not his early analysis, but he didn't want to risk getting kicked out of UA for saying no to the principal. He decided to hesitantly test the waters. Weren't these ones enough? Enough of what, he wasn't sure. He still didn't know why Nezu had been so interested in the first place. "Oh no, they definitely were enough. I was just curious what might have been contained in the gaps left by the other journals, so I thought I'd ask." Izuku let out an internal sigh of relief. "Before we talk about the content of these journals, because I absolutely must discuss some of the work you've put into them, I wanted to talk about your future at this school." His heart stopped, and his stomach dropped. This was it. He'd lasted a week, but now because of his stupid obsessive notebooks he was going to be kicked out. Breathing felt difficult as he tried to rapidly figure out what he would do next. After all, which high school would take in a quirkless student kicked out from UA? "I would like to arrange it so we can continue having meetings like this throughout the year. Of course, it would depend on your own schedule, and be subject to change if events require addressing during scheduled meeting times, but I was hoping we could find time once a week or so. Your analysis work is truly exemplary, and I would love to know more about your process, then work on expanding your knowledge." It took a moment for the words to sink in through Izuku's panic, but once they did, he wasn't left in much more coherent state. Not only was he not expelled, but Nezu, the principal, was offering future meetings and tutoring. It took a few moments, but eventually Izuku was able to stutter out an agreement. "Fantastic. Now," Nezu said, gesturing to the stack of notebooks, "on to the work you've already done." And just like that, Izuku was back to feeling apprehensive. In the end, the conversation went all right. They talked about the journals and the basics of Izuku's research process. Nezu seemed very interested by the fact that he could access the deep web, and they spent some time discussing the intricacies of the internet and how to access more restricted content. From there it moved to Nezu asking what kind of programs he used, to a full discussion on the topic as they compared strategies and software. They probably would have kept talking on the subject for hours, if not for the fact that Izuku realized the conversation was veering into dangerous territory, going from trying to find content to actively hacking into websites that should be protected. "That would be illegal," he summarized, cutting the discussion short. Nezu gave him a look he couldn't decipher. "Indeed it would." There was a lull, filled only by Izuku taking a tentative sip of the tea that had grown cold in front of him. "You went through a lot of effort for each of these heroes, Midoriya. Why?" Nezu had read through all the journals Midoriya had given him, and not only had he found a very talented analyst, he had also found a threat. With the information he had found, there was a very high chance he could hurt or kill the heroes he had tracked down, without ever being caught. Nezu needed to know that if he were to help Midoriya, there would be no chance of him turning and becoming a villain. Izuku felt that question resonate within him. Why had he done it at all? He could see the shape of the answer in the back of his mind, but he knew he wasn't ready to confront it. So he danced around the answer, trying to stick to the narrative that he'd just wanted a bit of support before he committed to becoming a hero, which was at least partially true. He also wasn't naive. He could tell that Nezu was searching for some specific answer, and their discussion on research had been purposely directed towards certain topics. He didn't want to insult Nezu, couldn't afford to disappoint him, but he definitely didn't trust him yet. After enough redirection, Nezu managed to pick up that he wasn't going to get a straight answer and moved on. Now, the biggest point I wanted to discuss with you this afternoon, that may take up the rest of our time, is this notebook here. He placed a paw on the topmost book. It was a red one, that much Izuku could see, but he wasn't sure what information it held. What about it? Nezu folded his paws together on the desk in front of him once more. In this notebook, you did a lot of research on rescue heroes, but the primary standout is a series of calculations you managed to do. How did you predict that landslide? Immediately, Izuku felt more grim. He'd seen the official death toll in the days following the landslide. It had become just one more thing to not think about, one more failure. All of my research should be in that notebook. It was really a matter of finding the right landmark, doing a bit of investigation, then running some calculations. Indeed. It was interesting to see the process of natural disaster prediction, which is quite a complicated task, fully written out and documented. However, it does leave me questioning why you wouldn't tell anyone. Some of your notes did include the potential severity of the fallout. Why not warn the people who were going to be affected? Izuku grit his teeth, guilt and anger making themselves known at the edge of his consciousness. I did. Nezu kept silently watching him, so he continued. I sent in anonymous tips to multiple places. No one really acted on them. Then why not try again, or potentially go to them in person to show them your evidence? The only thing I'd get from showing them my evidence would be a laugh out of the station or agency. Nezu looked as if he were about to speak, but Izuku didn't want to hear that he was just being anxious, that they would never do that. It's happened before. Surely, if you were able to present your evidence, they would have to take the information seriously. Besides, no two institutions are the same. He'd wanted to go there in person. He'd wished he could have walked through the doors and handed them a neat folder of information and had it taken seriously, but... It's happened before, he repeated. I've tried lots of different approaches and gone to different stations and agencies and individuals, but as soon as they take down my details and get my age and the fact that I'm quirkless, they brush it all off. Even in cases where they've taken the information, it was only to discard it when I wasn't looking. He could always tell, with the way they'd start speaking to him like he was a small child, the way they would stop paying attention to him aside from saying placating nothings until he left the building. The only thing that seems to work consistently is to find a direct communication path to a hero agency to report villain activity anonymously. And even then, the information has to be documented a certain way for it to gain attention or warrant a response. Natural disaster can't be presented like that. He'd learned to deal with smaller problems himself. Sometimes minor villains just needed someone to reach out with a solution to their situation, or residents in a dangerous zone could be told to evacuate for the day. No matter how much information he brought with him, if he was the one delivering it, it became worthless. I report things anonymously because at least there's a chance the information will be taken seriously. People can't be biased against a source that isn't connected to anyone. Sure, there's a higher chance of an anonymous tip being ignored, but at least then there's a chance. What he didn't say was that it also meant he wouldn't face being ignored in person, wouldn't be ridiculed and insulted until he left. It made sense why hero agencies and police stations would react that way, given that he was just a kid, quirkless, and his information was drawn from a lot of sources that weren't reliable, but that didn't make the experience any better. Nezu seemed to mull that over. If I'd had the chance to read through your work as presented in this notebook, I assure you I would have taken action and made sure others joined so that preventative measures could have been put in place. Now it was Izuku's turn to turn over the statement. He believed that the hero would have done something about the matter if he'd known, and might have read through Izuku's work, but no one would have joined Nezu in making preventative measures if they knew the information came from a quirkless 14-year-old. No one listened to Izuku or trusted his information. In the future, if you ever find information like this, I'd appreciate if you gave it to me. I understand now that many people in this field are quick to dismiss you, but if you bring it to me, then I can make sure it's acted upon. Izuku tentatively agreed. While he doubted it would be acted on if his name was attached, he could always ask Nezu to keep any mention of him out of it. As long as Izuku's sources were solid, and he'd done enough work, no one would have any reason to believe Nezu was relying on his information. Afterwards, they spoke of setting up future meetings. When Izuku admitted that he didn't have after-school commitments aside from homework, they agreed to once a week after school, with the days subject to change. Nezu suggested that Izuku bring forward some ideas next session, such as a specific thing he wanted to discuss, or a skill to learn. It was easy to agree to that, considering how much Nezu would know when it came to practical analysis and working in heroics. By the end of the meeting, he felt a lot more comfortable with his journals back in his possession. It helped that he knew he wasn't going to be expelled due to them, and that his work had stood up to Nezu's scrutiny. There was also the smallest sense of relief in the question that Nezu hadn't asked. There were a lot of heroes listed in those journals, but no tally, no final amount listed. He hoped that the principal would never ask him just how many heroes he'd asked. But that was just another thing not to think about. Not yet. Besides, he had homework to do, and research to start. He'd thought his afternoons had felt empty with just homework to keep him busy. Of course, he found other stuff to do. After talking with Powerloader, he'd been trying to figure out the best support items to integrate into his costume, and ranking them on how easy they'd be to use, how complex they were, and how expensive they'd be. While something like Aizawa's capture weapon would be useful in combat, at least until he learned to fight using hand-to-hand, proper support equipment like that wasn't cheap, and he could make do with what he had now. Nothing could have prepared him for how bad the weekend was going to be. After doing his usual morning exercise, cleaning his room, and getting up to date on hero news and his forums, he didn't have anything left to do. Just as he was considering raindexing his digital library of resources and compiled information, Inko appeared at his door, looking rather frazzled, trying to put her hair up while rummaging around in her handbag. "Izuku, I'm so sorry. Work just called, so I'm going in. I should be home in time for dinner, but I'm not sure. Don't wait for me if you get hungry." Izuku watched as she finally managed to get her phone out of her bag, before dropping it back in there after getting a look at the time. "I feel like I'm forgetting something, but I have to go. Love you. Have fun, and don't forget to do your homework." Hearing her close the front door behind her, Izuku leaned back in his chair. He wished he had homework to do. Deciding to plan something nice for dinner so that his mom wouldn't have to worry about it regardless of whether or not she made it home in time, he made his way to the kitchen. However, he quickly came across a problem. They usually went shopping on the weekend for their weekly supplies, and they were currently low on everything. While shopping was usually an annoying time sink, since they tried to make the most of any specials that may be on offer from different stores, now it was a blessing. Something to do. And on the way there, he could work on his stamina. Getting to the store wasn't a problem, though he had to quickly detour and duck under an overhang when he noticed Kokoroshi, who was making a fair detour from their usual route if they were crossing paths here, approaching. What he was doing wasn't illegal, but he didn't exactly feel like being questioned by a hero on what he was doing, running across rooftops on a late Saturday morning. It was as he was walking out of the store, holding on to numerous bag handles in a death grip, hoping that they wouldn't give in on the walk home, that his problem started, because as he made his way down the street, a voice unfortunately familiar reached him. "Is that Deku?" He turned his head a fraction, and sure enough, it was a trio of his old classmates. Shit. He tried ducking his head and walking faster, but they'd already recognized him, and his old t-shirt and shorts did nothing to hide his distinctive hair. It only took a few moments for them to catch up with him, which wasn't that difficult given his short legs and the amount of groceries he was carrying at the moment. "Oi, Deku, it's been a while, huh? Finally decided to show your face in the real world for once." They all laughed at that, but it was hardly the worst thing he'd heard, even from just this group. Almost as if they'd heard his thoughts, it got worse. After a few rounds of poking at his appearance and how they were surprised he hadn't dropped dead yet for being such a waste of space, they moved on to newer topics, namely UA. Even if Izuku hadn't really processed that he'd gotten in, everyone else had heard his homeroom teacher announce it, before quickly brushing it off as some sort of mistake. So he was treated to insults about being pathetic enough to try for the school and jabbing questions about where he went to school now. If there were even high schools out there that would accept useless, quirkless students. The one thing he had to be thankful through all of this was that they didn't push him around, though that was probably because of the fairly populated street they were currently on. If it weren't for the groceries he'd loaded up on, and the fact that dishing them would be a waste of both food and money that he couldn't afford, he'd have slipped into an alley and scaled a building by now. It felt like a dramatic response, since this was just bullying, and climbing buildings was usually his response to criminals and villain attacks, but that didn't change the fact that he didn't want to be there. The three of them had boxed him in, and he was sure that once they reached a quieter place they'd turn on him. Even drowning out most of their words, he could still hear them, carried to his ears by memory. He made a turn. On the next one, they'd be entering a less trafficked street. That's where they'd do whatever they'd planned on doing, since they started following him. He just wanted to go shopping. Nearly every time he went into the outside world and just tried to be normal or realistic, something like this would happen. The thought bubbled up inside of him. As the anticipation from the three around him grew, he felt his jaw clench as they made the next turn onto a completely empty street. A hand reached out a few meters later. To push or grab him, he wasn't sure, but he'd had enough. Quickly adjusting his grip on his bags, he sprinted forward, followed by cries from his old classmates. He could hear their footsteps approaching, knew he couldn't outrun them like this, so if he was going to be harassed and hurt again, Izuku decided that he was going to get some answers. Just as suddenly as he'd taken off, he stopped, pivoting to face his pursuers. Why can't someone quirkless be a hero? The question was more of a shout, echoing slightly between the buildings. His classmates skidded to a halt, the three of them probably confused by a Deku that didn't keep running until he either got away or was caught. And then they started laughing. Are you deaf as well? Haven't you heard what we've been saying the past 3 years? Oi, I had to suffer through the same elementary school as him for 2 extra years. The tallest just gave the other boy a playful shove on the shoulder. Right, you'd think they would have kept him there since he's too stupid to learn anything past elementary shit. Who'd want to keep Deku anywhere? Was the laughed-out response of the first one. Not to mention weak. The tallest switched his tone to the kind of voice you'd use with a child, leaning down a bit to complete the image. Hey, Deku, how far was that run? 1 block? You feeling tired already? Is that the real reason you stopped? No, guys. Remember, he definitely got into UA because he's super strong and powerful. You've just been playing the long game, huh, Deku? The first one squared up, something nasty in his expression that reminded Izuku of Bakugo at his worst. Wanted to make us all look stupid like you. You never were good at being a liar. Can't even cheat right. What use are you? I mean, seriously, even if you got into UA, then what would you do? Right? Besides, who would ever want to be saved by a quirkless hero? I'd rather be killed by a villain than have to go through that. They all laughed. Not that you'd ever be able to save anyone. I reckon the second you came across a villain, you'd just die from being that pathetic. Some of what they were saying hit home for Izuku. He wasn't able to fight. No one would accept him as a hero. He had no quirk and was worthless in the end. But he could do better. He hadn't been kicked out of UA yet, and Aizawa seemed to think he had some potential. He'd just have to work harder than anyone else, like he always had to. He couldn't afford to drop below average, to prove that he was worth his spot, before any of them realized it had been one giant mistake. As they'd spoken, his classmates, bullies, his mind supplied, because that's what they've always been, had gotten closer, forcing Izuku's mind away from their words and onto any strategy that could get him out of this situation without losing his groceries. There was nothing he could use on this street, and there was no way he could make it through the back streets without them catching up before he could slip away. His solution came a moment later, when the ground started shaking. Arriving in a white and purple streak, Mount Lady was running between the buildings, shouting something at a blur before her. As his former classmates turned to watch her pass and make sure they weren't accidentally crushed, Izuku made a break for it. He knew this area inside and out, so it was easy to weave around the back roads and alleyways in a way that would hopefully mean he couldn't be followed. The entire time, the question circled through his mind. Why did this always happen? Why did his classmates hate him so much? Why did the world? Why can't someone quirkless be a hero? After revealing he was quirkless, he'd been sure UA would be a repeat of middle school, at least when it came to the other students. But as the second week of the year started, he felt that he could be wrong. Aside from the weird looks he sometimes got, especially during training lessons when he worked on physical skills and his slingshot marksmanship while they worked through quirk-based activities, no one had done anything out of the ordinary. Aside from Sero asking where he'd learned to climb buildings if that hadn't been his quirk. Hero tube, he'd answered. In practice. They'd mostly left him alone, but for some reason it didn't feel like the social ostracization he usually went through. Now it was lunchtime, and he was walking to the cafeteria with Uraraka, Ida, and Shinso. He still couldn't say he trusted them, even after Shinso had joined him for lunch at the support department, and hinted that his own experience with people hadn't been that positive. But he'd been honest, seemed to come from a similar place, and probably wanted a friend just as badly, so Izuku was willing to give him a chance. He was in a similar position with Uraraka. She hadn't changed after he'd revealed his quirklessness. In fact, her cheerfulness had acted as a buffer that day, locking out anyone who tried to comment on him. Ida, on the other hand, kept frowning slightly when he looked at Izuku, though he didn't seem to realize Izuku had spotted him doing it several times, since he refrained from doing it when it'd be noticeable. He hadn't said anything yet, though. So when Uraraka had asked him if he wanted to join her and Ida for lunch the day after the reveal, he'd said yes, inviting Shinso along as well. The rest of the week had followed that same pattern, the four of them eating together, and it seemed like it'd continue. He could only hope so. If he was lucky, if he didn't mess up, he might be able to add friends with them. Ida was giving a lecture on proper meal balance to Shinzo as they walked today, after the purple-haired boy had made the mistake of admitting that he forgot to eat breakfast most days. Watching Ida's hands move made Izuku wonder how many people he'd hit on accident, or if he'd thought of training in some kind of martial art to make the most of the habit. That train of thought was interrupted, however, by All Might, appearing through a connected hallway, smile as bright as ever. He was ready to duck his head and hurry past the hero when his name was called. He froze, turning his head to see that yes, All Might was calling out to him.
"I was wondering if I might be able to speak with you, my boy."
It was technically a question, but with his friendly, booming voice it sounded more like a command. Toshinori had recognized that the kid, who could have been a successor, and had shown himself to be smart and kind, knew the secret of his form and time limit. And if he was as smart as Nezu had suggested, then he could use that information against him. Therefore it would be a good idea to see where they stood, and what better time than over lunch. Over a year ago, he would have said yes without hesitation, but over a year ago there'd be no chance that he'd have gotten into UA. All Might was the first hero who had crushed his dreams, which had led him to ask others, a cruel, disheartening path that had somehow brought him to UA, and closer to achieving his dream. And now that hero, his past idol, who he could barely stand to look at, was asking if they could talk. No. Izuku knew that there were other people in the hallway, other sounds being made, but in that moment everything felt silent to him. All Might also seemed to be having trouble, standing there with his ever-present smile, but with eyebrows slanted in the way that hinted at a frown.
"Is there any particular reason why? Surely you can spare a few moments."
Whatever the hero was feeling, it didn't change his tone. That didn't stop Izuku from seeing a skeleton of a man telling him to be realistic, a hero watching as he drowned in sludge night after night. Even now, looking at All Might's expectant face, he could feel phantom sludge running down his throat. He tried to work through it the night after the battle trials, knowing he'd be seeing the #1 hero in classes, but he hadn't been able to shake the twisted, crushing feeling that appeared in his gut whenever he saw the hero's familiar face. I can't. Not yet. You are my favorite hero, and it's too much. Please just leave me alone." The sentence was choked out, but it was as good of an explanation as the hero was going to get. He would usually try and play it off, come up with some other reason, but it was all he could do today to turn from his former hero and keep walking. Toshinori watched the boy turn, and wasn't sure how to take the rejection. Usually the only people who disliked him were those who hated the spotlight like Aizawa or villains. He did, however, get the impression that he'd made a huge mistake. The others quickly fell back into step with Izuku as he continued towards the cafeteria, having stepped back as he'd talked to All Might, but they'd definitely been within earshot. Shinzo was the first to point it out, letting out a sigh and asking in his usual monotone, "What was that?" "Nothing." Unfortunately, that set Ida off. "I would hardly call that nothing. All Might is not only an esteemed hero, but one of our teachers. It is disrespectful to decline an invitation like that, especially without giving adequate reasoning. You would have to have quite the important reason to say no in such a manner, and at the very least, given that reason to him." Izuku had a reason. He had a whole year of desperation documented in notebooks and his computer, all of it started by All Might, as proof of his reason. But there was no way he could show that to them. They would think he is crazy, a fanboy gone mental, nowhere near the heroic material needed for UA. And once they realized that, they'd turn on him, and the rest of the class would soon follow. He also couldn't deny what he'd just done, which was stupid. He should have just said yes to avoid the questions of his classmates. But he knew, even if he'd said yes, there was no way his body could have gone through with following the hero, no way his mind could have formulated the words to speak with him. So he chose to share a half-truth. "Last year I was in a villain attack. I almost died, but All Might saved my life. The problem is I still associate All Might with almost dying, so I can't. It's hard to be around him." He expected some ridicule for that. He was in the heroics course. He should be fine, but weathering a bit of ridicule was better than telling the full truth. "Well, that fucking sucks, dude." "Language!" Shinzo just shrugged off Ida's reprimand. "He is right, though," Uraraka added. "It does suck. Maybe next time you could tell All Might that, so it's more clear to him. He looked pretty confused there." She giggled at that, and Shinzo joined in with his own low chuckle.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the only people who'd ever decline lunch with All Might are villains, and if he's around, I doubt they're worried about lunch. The two of them looked to Izuku slightly expectant, so he put on a small smile that almost felt real. While he still felt shaken by All Might's direct approach, he felt much better after having lunch with the three of them, even if he was only able to get down a few bites of his own food. His day improved even more as it ended, and once again he made his way to the support department. The doors were double reinforced and still on their hinges this time, but there were several fist-sized holes in the wall between the hallway and the workshop. Just what had managed to punch the wall but not shatter through the glass across the hall, Izuku had no idea, but he hoped he'd never have to find out. Entering the classroom gave away no more clues, though it did reveal Majima, head in hand, talking to himself about a pink menace. Izuku walked a bit further into the room before clearing his throat, catching the hero's attention. "Ah, Midoriya, how are you?" The grumbling tone completely switched as Majima's head had perked up and caught sight of him. "Good, thank you." Izuku would have asked the hero the same question in return, but he was already digging around under his desk, and Izuku was pretty sure Majima's day had not been the best if the obvious property damage was any indication. When he appeared back from under the desk, it was with something in hand. "Now, it's not my best work," he began, walking around the desk towards Izuku. "I usually have more time to plan and construct a project before the deadline, but it'll stand up to the other heroic students' costume standards. Of course, if there's something wrong with it, you can take it back here for repairs or adjustments. There's just a chance it'll be one of the older students altering it. Gives them experience, you know." And then he was in front of Izuku, holding out a briefcase with a bold 18 printed across the front. Izuku took the case gingerly, placing it on a nearby bench to open it. This time, it wasn't empty. He ran a hand over the different materials, folded neatly to fit in the confined space. The colors were dark, making it hard to notice any shapes or seams, but he could feel them under his fingertips. "Well, are you going to try it?" Majima's voice started Izuku, breaking him out of his reverie. "Of course, you could always just keep looking at it when it's all folded up and boring, but I did make it to be worn." He was smiling, joking, but Izuku still felt spurred into action. "Right, sorry." Izuku only had to whip around for a second, looking for a place to change, before Majima chuckled and pointed him in the direction of a connected storeroom. The costume itself was fairly simple, with only a few extra components to make sure it would be easy to put on. Despite the simple design, Izuku loved it. The main body was a simple, dark gray bodysuit made of a durable material to blend in better with the urban landscape Izuku had grown to know so well. Stretching revealed no restrictions to movement, something that made Izuku incredibly happy. On top of the bodysuit went a vest, modeled after the bulletproof ones police officers wore. It was shorter and tighter to ensure it wouldn't get in the way, but would still help keep his vitals safe in a fight. Next were two items that Izuku was incredibly excited to try, given the request he'd asked of Majima. Since Izuku specialized in mobility, he wanted shoes and gloves that could help him. Feeling the bottoms of his shoes and the palms of his fingerless gloves, he smiled at the fact that Majima had pulled through. It was nothing special, just a rougher, more gripping material, but it was perfect. In addition, the shoes, which Majima had originally suggested to be combat boot-like, were supple on the bottom to allow for easier climbing, and made of a tougher material on top for protection. Lacing them up revealed that the part that covered his shins was reinforced even further, and Izuku could sense that banging his shins wouldn't be a problem whenever he wore the costume. After that, he only had to put on the belt, knee guards, wrist guards, and a hood that could be pulled up over his head to hide, or up around his mouth to help filter air, and it was complete. He would never stand out in an outfit like this, but that didn't matter, because it was his. He admired it for a bit longer, fiddling with different parts of it to make sure it sat right, before taking a deep breath and stepping back out into the workshop. "Not too bad," Majima greeted him with a thumbs up, putting down the object he'd been fiddling with. "Might do with some small adjustments, but it seems to fit well. How does it feel? Need anything added?" Izuku could only shake his head, feeling close to tears already. Majima chuckled at him. "All right then, why don't you try out the slings?" Izuku gave him a blank look, not having found any slings in the case, only for Majima to tap his own wrists. "I built them into the wrist guards, so you won't have to worry about digging them out of a bag or having to unwind them from a sort of holster. They're secured magnetically to stay flat and not slide off." Sure enough, inspecting the wrist guards revealed that there was a lighter material wrapped around them. Pulling on it gently, the sling came undone from its resting place. The sling itself was a good length and decent shape, but Izuku was more invested in the design of the guards and the effort Majima had gone to in order to make them. This is amazing. Majima just waved away the whispered praise when Izuku finally pulled his eyes away from the guards and sling. Don't say that until you know you can hit something with them. Right. Izuku perked up at that, excited to try out his very first piece of support equipment. Do you have anything I can use as ammunition? Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. I was thinking we could attach a pouch for ammo onto your belt, but I wasn't sure what kind of shape and size ammo would work best with a sling, so I left it until I could ask. Izuku shrugged. I usually just use what I can find. Most of the time that ended up being bits of debris or rocks, but he'd had to get creative a few times and ended up hitting villains with whatever he'd managed to get his hands on in time. He'd lost a shoe that way, but it had done the job well enough to be worth it. Majima used an arm to gesture to the whole room. And by all means, if it's not part of a project or nailed down, it's up for grabs. Let's see what you've got. Scanning the room, Izuku settled on a screw left on a nearby bench. He loaded it into the sling, swaying it back and forth to get a feel of the weight. What am I aiming for? Majima's eyes instantly went to the furthest corner of the room where a pile of projects had begun accumulating. There's a light bulb on the top creation with a blue glass cover. Aim for that. Higari might have been feeling a little vindictive, pointing out a target of one of Hatsume's creations, but it could be easily replaced and hard to hit in the first place. Letting the sling swing by his side for a few seconds, Izuku sized up the distance between himself and the target before whipping it around and letting go of one end, sending the screw flying. There was a small smash as the projectile met its mark, followed by the gentle tinkling as it bounced down the pile and landed on the floor. Nice job! Maybe try a few different sizes, see what feels best. Then I can get you some ammunition that suits you. Needing no further encouragement, Izuku began aiming at whatever point Majima called out, using a variety of loose ends to hit the targets. It was only when Izuku progressed past fist-sized projectiles that they stopped. The slings, Izuku had tested the other one as well to make sure they both were balanced, weren't built for anything too big, and it wasn't practical either. Damn, I could use you in class. You could hit one of my students to stop her before she starts getting too out of hand. Izuku thought back to Majima's earlier grumbling. The doors. The support hero let out a long, loud sigh at that. Yeah. They finished up shortly after that, with Majima now possessing the specifications of Izuku's ammo, and Izuku insisting that no adjustments were needed. Working through targets with Majima, using support gear made for him, Izuku had come to the realization that he was actually on the path to becoming a hero. Not just studying, researching, and exercising. He was in the heroics course, now with a costume of his own because these people believed in him enough to provide him with one. He even had a teacher that thought he could be a hero and was willing to support him as he worked towards that goal. He still had trouble sleeping most nights and knew that the second he started to fall behind, he'd be left behind, but as he took off his hero costume so it could be placed in its case and put back into the heroics classroom, he felt like things might be able to change for the better. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 3. The second half to Chapter 3 will be up next. Hope you all are still enjoying this fic, and as always, thank you so much for listening.